All right, well, welcome back. I'm very, very excited about this for three reasons. One is that I'm a geek, and so for somebody who's a geek like me, merging AI and AVs, right, automated vehicles, is about as fun as it gets. It's kind of like that kid show Dinosaur Train, where they just said, what are things that little kids like? Dinosaurs and trains, let's make dinosaur trains. Which, you know, no offense to labor statistics, but AI and labor statistics doesn't feel quite the same to me, so that's exciting. The second reason, my daughter just turned 13, and so please, God, let's solve this in the next
exactly.
That's another reason why I'm really excited. And then the third reason is, and the most important reason is, we have an awesome, awesome panel. So let me introduce them. Part of the reason I'm introducing them, it may help you to know to whom you should direct your questions. But to my immediate left is Lori Veneer. She's our own here at Duke. She is the Julie Plant Granger Associate Professor of Energy, Economics, and Policy at the Nicholas School for the Environment. And she has secondary appointments at the Sanford School of Public Policy and the Economics Department here. Is that all still right?
Yes, that's all correct.
She's the Associate Director of the Educational Programs at the Duke University Energy Initiative and Faculty Co-Director of Rethinking Regulation Program at the Kenan Institute of Ethics, so one of our co-sponsors along with Jonathan Wiener. So there's a whole lot more. I could say a whole lot more. But one thing that I just wanted to mention, I've had the pleasure of sitting in on her transportation-related course that they're running this year. Interdisciplinary group, a lot of great discussion going on in that class. I wish we could all just be a fly on the wall for that. So I'm going to jump over to Michael Clamann. Dr. Clamann is several things, and I'm going to go ahead and share. So he's the SciPol lead. We heard about science policy before, for the robotics and artificial intelligence vertical through the Institute for Science and Society. He's a human factors engineer. In fact, he's a certified human factors professional. I think that's important for some of the questions that we may ask. He's a senior research scientist in the Humans and Autonomy Lab, the HAL, with Duke Robotics. And then, if I may say, we get him as his last full day here at Duke. He is moving on he'll still be with us to some degree, but to be UNC's Highway Safety Research Center's lead on their new human factors automated vehicles lab. So that's pretty exciting. And so thank you so much for spending your last day really with us here, which is great. Not last day ever, but last day. And then finally in the middle here is Bryant Walker-Smith. He's an assistant professor at the School of Law at the University of South Carolina Law School, and has appointments at the School of Engineering. I'm going to read a few things, just read these, because I think it's really important to hear all the ways in which he's involved in this field. So he's an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School, an adjunct clinical professor at University of Michigan Law School, or has been, a member of the U.S. Department of Transportation's Advisory Committee on Automation and Transportation, chair of the Emerging Technology Law Committee of the Transportation Research Board of the National Academies, and reporter to the Uniform Law Commission's Drafting Committee on Highly Automated Vehicles. And then, I'm not done, the chair of the Planning Task Force for the One Road Automated Vehicle Standards Committee of the Society of Automotive and Aerospace Engineers. I could, again, go on and on. A couple of things, so I've got to see Lori teach. It's been wonderful. Michael is one of the most frequent guests in my class on artificial intelligence, and is always much beloved by the students. And then I've also had the pleasure of seeing Bryant give a presentation introducing a whole bunch of newbies to artificial intelligence. And it was not only outstanding, spot on, pithy, but also funny. So people enjoyed it. You don't always see somebody get a technical introduction and people laughing in good ways. So thank you all for being here. All right, with all that introduction, we are not going to do spoken introductions each. We're just going to have a conversation. Because of that, we'll get through some questions, but if there are parts of these conversations that you want to participate in, don't wait till the end, throw up your hand, and we'll have a conversation. So this topic is a little bit different than all our other ones. For some reasons, AV and AI is a little bit uniquely situated. None of this, unlike patents, none of this would be happening without AI, right? We would not be talking about automated vehicles without AI. The public safety function is almost entirely dependent on the success of our AI, so that's a little bit different here. To a significant degree, the regulation of AI and AI in regulation here is merged in a way that is not true. We cannot disaggregate in a way as we might be able to with other panels. And then, unlike, for instance, again, the USPTO, there's a very significant state municipal aspect to the AI use in this arena. So I think all of those are a little bit different to set it up. So Before we get to automated vehicles, I want to ask a question, if I may, around AI and transportation generally, which would be, what are the ways in which smart cities, Marjorie mentioned smart cities, just smart cities in the last panel, what are the ways that AI might play a role in smart cities to help with whatever our goals might be? Okay. Take it in whatever turn you'd like.
All right, cool. You were looking at me uncomfortably. I was like, okay, I'll do it. So cities, as I mentioned, we talked about, are really complex places. And when people say that AI is a non-deterministic system that's hard to evaluate, I say, well, yeah, so are people. And so are people in groups like cities, and we've been trying to deal with them for years, decades, centuries. And so I think AI could in some ways help us deal with the cities we have, the cities we're going to have because of these technologies, and really the cities we want to have, in the way that we can use these as tools, as well as technical and policy tools to reach that. So specifically, automated driving, other advanced technologies are going to come up with a whole bunch of data. I mean, these are massive sensors on wheels connected back to servers, and those could be very useful if they're like vignettes. They're these small vignettes about city life. But what's going to be challenging is actually connecting them to a bigger picture. To understanding how what you're observing actually impacts other functions beyond transportation. Right. And getting a sense of not just the magnitude of some changes, but really the direction of some of those changes, because that's uncertain. So AI in that sense, I think, could be useful in setting up the kinds of large-scale simulations that automated driving developers are doing right now with respect to those streets, but that we really should be doing with respect to the city. Understanding in almost an antagonistic or interactive way how cities really fit together as we use AI as a proxy for humans to model how systems might interact within the system of the city.
Great.
Was that vague enough?
That's a great intro.
Okay,
actually.
cool.
Yes, thank you so much. Anything to add?
Yeah, well, if Brian's going to go with vague, I'll go with specific.
Nice.
So, as we've discussed in some of the previous sessions, when we talk about artificial intelligence, we're talking about making use of large amounts of data, something that is hard for a human being to deal with. And so there's a number of research efforts that are already underway with some of these technologies. And that's the great thing about AVs, is that as we start, it's not like we're going to suddenly switch our cars off one day and move into AVs. All that technology that we're creating to develop AVs is useful right now, and it's going to continue to be useful in the interim as we make that move. So some of the things that we're able to do with data, and I'm going to stay away from the car itself mostly. One example would be incident detection. So if an accident happens on the highway, we've got all these different ways of watching, watching the streets with cameras and different types of sensing technologies. We could automatically detect when an incident occurs, and maybe once we're able to reliably do that, then maybe we could actually go so far as to initiate some kind of a response. Another thing that could happen if something that goes beyond the current in-car diagnostics that we have. So right now you've got the check engine light, or the so-called idiot light. Like if something's going wrong, you don't get a whole lot of information about it. So maybe there are ways with it, using artificial intelligence to give a more holistic or a better view of what's going on inside your car. And this type of technology is going to be extremely important as we start making the move toward autonomous vehicles, because we're still going to need ways. If you're not going to be driving, you don't have that same road feel. You're not as well integrated in that driving system. There's going to need to be a way to inform you or whoever the owner of the vehicle is, whether it's a fleet or whatever, to tell them that it's time for the car to get maintenance. So there's another one. A big one that's an issue right now is with accident investigation. So right now, if there's an accident, there's a number of different data fields that the police officer needs to fill out, or whoever's there at the scene. They fill out the accident report, and then it gets submitted and added to a database. it would be fantastic if those data reports were consistent from one municipality to another. Then we could actually start harnessing that data to create interventions to make the roads a bit safer. So either use AI to create the report itself, or to analyze the data to figure out, is there any, what's going wrong, and to maybe identify interventions to fix the problems. Because one of the things that is kind of surprising about looking at road safety data is how little we understand different relationships that kind of coincide to result in accidents. So if we had ways to look at multiple factors at the same time to see what was going on, that would be extremely beneficial. There's an example project I'm working on right now with machine learning and accident investigation. I'm looking at a database that's just on North Carolina data, and I have 350 columns of data to look from, all of which be interacting to result in some kind of incident or accident on the roadways. And looking at them one at a time or two at a time, takes a really long time. Having machine learning algorithms is much faster, more effective for looking at those data. And then another one, which is a big area of research, is moving from kind of this central organization supervision of traffic to a more decentralized supervision of traffic. So if we can control from multiple points rather than from single points of trying to improve traffic flow, the more you can distribute that out to smaller areas, the more effectively you could monitor traffic. The last one I had of what we're working on is something that Bryant already mentioned, was with developing better and better simulations. So as we can move from some of the current simulation technology to using things that are more sophisticated, we can create better and better, more higher fidelity simulations that we can then give to a number of different people, including AV manufacturers, to test different scenarios for AVs and try to get them on the road a little bit sooner.
Great. So I think there's lots of ways in which artificial intelligence, broadly writ, could be transformative to cities. Some of which they've already talked about. Another one could be about efficient traffic flow and parking, right? So if you can have better predictive models of when parking will be more challenging, you can price it differently so that you sort of smooth out people's driving around and circling around to find a parking spot, and change people's driving patterns. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about how, in particular, highly automated vehicles as a type of AI could be transformative to cities, and why it's so critical, in my opinion, that people in city governments who are not trained to think about this in their planning processes necessarily have to start thinking about what they want the city of the future to look like and how to put policies in place to accommodate that. Because there are these sort of highly optimistic views of the city of the future with AVs, where there are these pods that are roaming around at all times. When I need a vehicle, if it's just me, I can call for a very small one-person pod. That if it's my whole family, we get a bigger pod. It takes me where I need to go. There's no more need for parking, really, so all of these parking lots can be transformed into beautiful green space. There's no need for stop signs, signage, and other icky-looking things, because they could be giving signals from embedded technology in the roads to the vehicles. That sounds great. I like that view of the city. But there's another view, which I think, frankly, is more likely if we don't take concerted action, which is that we just decrease the cost of driving a whole lot. Everybody still owns their car, but now I can live, for those of you like in Roxborough or wherever, get a nice cheap house an hour away. That hour is a great time for me to answer emails, do my phone calls on my way into the office, and we can create, sprawl. Everybody's still at their own cars. We're still parking in these lots. So what kind of future do we want to have created with this technology? And how do we train people who are going to be in decision-making roles about this, which are really far more local governments than we've been thinking about in the past, to anticipate what these challenges might be and develop long-term strategies that can help us get to the vision of the city that we want, as opposed to, Atlanta everywhere. Sprawl everywhere.
So that's actually such a nice transition. So we mentioned a lot of things about these massive sensors on roads connected to servers. I like that. You should be a poet. Bryant. But the, so, it's incident detection and response. I now know it's called an idiot light, and I don't even ever know what it means, so I'm not sure what that makes me. But, augmenting our things that are mentioned in the National Artificial Intelligence Research and Development Strategic Plan are things like augmenting our modes of travel, impacting safety materially, structural health monitoring for bridges and other kinds of infrastructure management, freight systems and how we can organize the movement of goods, not just people, reducing overall system energy, which is something that we might get to, our transportation-related emissions. So then Lori brought us to this, and so that's several things that I think are uses but also goals. Safety is the one that everybody moves to, right? That's one why I mentioned about my 13-year-old daughter, right? Safety is important. I see her friends text, and I don't want them driving her anywhere, right? Here we've mentioned maybe some energy impacts. You're asking us, though, what kind of future do we want to be? Before we move on to other things, I'd love to ask, what should some of our goals be, if you're willing to share? I mean, safety being, I think we're going to take that one for granted, right? So,
Yeah, so I work at the Energy Initiative, and of course, we would like to see a future where we actually have greater energy efficiency and cleaner transportation technologies than what are on the roads today. But again, I don't necessarily think that's a given purely as a function of highly automated vehicles. Yeah.
One of the other big ones, again, I can't emphasize enough. I mean, safety is my primary goal with this, but another big one is access. There's some people who aren't able to drive for any number of reasons, and whether it's through a disability or economics, that there are some models at this point that would allow those people transportation through AVs.
And I would add community to that, in the sense of that a lot of these technologies will analytically have to decide what to include and exclude from our models. And I think that relates to ultimately application, because we will be implicitly or explicitly deciding who to include in our communities that they create. I agree that we need to empower cities. And I'm concerned when I see these technologies in some ways leading to the opposite. I want to see the public space remain vibrant and remain important. One of my fears is that we're going to see subtle or dramatic shifts that we don't really anticipate because of these technologies, where people get enamored with automated driving in the same way they were enamored with cars in the 50s, and say, well, all these pedestrians stepping in front of our vehicles are really slowing down our traffic because they keep stopping rather than hitting them. So why don't we put up big fences? And likewise, I could see police legitimately in good faith saying, well, gosh, we don't have the interactions with the people and with motorists anymore, so we're going to shift our enforcement activities to pedestrians, to another interface. And likewise, see a lot of enforcement shifting from therefore the public to the private spaces that these companies create based on who they let into their shared vehicles, based on who or what cities they let access their information.
So you raised this a little bit, Lori, but to use Brian's conception of the city as one place that we're thinking about this, one controlled area, right, where we're making some decisions. But you need people to be able to look out and see, how do we get to these goals based on the decisions we make now? Well, Michael, you brought up in our earlier conversation this question about expertise, right? This is true. We've been talking about this everywhere, but you could imagine, it's easier for me to imagine finding the right person at the USPTO to lead an effort on AI than it is for every municipality in, right, so there you go. Than it is for Roxborough and every other municipality around the United States to be not only having that person who knows what's happening now, but to be able to predict the future and start to kind of guide municipal decision-making in that way. So this raises a couple questions I'm just going to pose to you. How do we get that capacity? And to what degree does that force us to rely on private entities, car makers, the OEMs, the others, in order to be driving this policy forward?
I think to a great degree, it does rely on outsourcing. I think with a couple of the presentations that we saw already, or was it that 5 times as many of the IT folks are above the age of 60, and statistics like that. And right now, if you're a young computer scientist or electrical engineer coming out of a good university, who are you going to go work for? I mean, are you going to go work for your local government, or are you going to go work for Amazon or for Facebook or something like that, where you're going to make, well into the six figures? And so, right now, that's the course that we're on, is that there is not really a move for that expertise to go into government. And so definitely there needs to be a way to be able to reach out to those folks to get them in there. But then, it brings up the question, if that's where they are, I mean, are they going to be acting, impartially when they get questions from government? I mean, we also talked this morning about, the larger companies that are influencing, state and local policy. So if you are the ones if you're outsourcing that to those individuals, do you then run the risk of bias in that? And so, yeah, I mean, it brings up a number of questions I don't have necessarily answers to. I would love to see some of these questions being answered by academia, maybe through third parties that are set up specifically for these types of issues. But yeah, I mean, it remains an issue.
So I grew up in a small North Carolina town in the 60s that had right on red before anywhere else in the state did. What's the likelihood of, I'm glad that the rest of you adopted Lexington's practice. What's the likelihood that we would end up with different laws if the municipalities are controlling some of how this is managed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think just from a logistics standpoint, there's going to have to be some harmony in terms of what the algorithm thinks certain signals mean for it to do, right? If every municipality has a different way of signaling to the vehicle that this means stop, the car and software manufacturers are going to have a hissy fit, I would imagine. So at some point, I think there will be some standardization of that. I don't know. I don't think every municipality has to have somebody on staff that is an expert in AI, right? I think, big cities at least, and need to have somebody on staff who can talk somewhat comfortably with experts in this space and think about what it means for their city. But there are already networks of cities that are coordinating and organizing on a variety of different things, climate action, and where they're learning from one another's experiments, right, and seeing what works. Okay, right on red, that was a good one. We'll adopt that. Right, left on red, maybe not so much. But it does mean that there have to be, I guess, younger tech-savvy people who think of this as an interesting and promising place for them to be. And historically, I mean, I teach at a school of the environment. We sent, now it's a much lower number, but we used to send about a third of our students into government, but almost all to the federal government. Nobody was really looking to states and municipalities. Now that has shifted dramatically in the last couple of years when the federal government was like, nah. We've seen a real interest in state and local governments, but I do think that's a huge challenge. We talked about the brain drain at the federal level with the retirements. At cities and states, it's going to be even worse, I think.
I think standardization is necessary or sufficient for a lot of these technologies, in part because of AI, in part because of the need for responsiveness to local conditions, and local conditions can include law. In part, I think this would be best addressed in some of the ways you described by empowering cities so that they are not vulnerable customers of big companies, but rather worthy partners who can bring something to the table. And that doesn't require employing someone necessarily, but having somebody who can ask the difficult questions at an abstract level. Do the kinds of things that, liberal arts majors are good at, judges are good at. To say, are you asking the right questions? Are you missing big sections? Do your conclusions follow from your premises? That would be the kind of valuable interaction I like to see with these companies.
I'd like to return to that public-private connection in a minute. First of all, a clarifying question: does right on red mean before that you could not turn right at a red light? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, not.
You are clearly too young.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm in that over
Thanks for
60
making me feel
I'm sorry. I was going to say I know neither Lexington nor the 60s, so I had to ask. Hey.
So following up on that, comment on how much the technological development needs to build in standardization of how of a vision, sort of a centralized vision of whether things will evolve in, your A or B scenarios or anything in between, and how much the technology can evolve in a way that would allow local jurisdictions to sort of evolve, an evolutionary approach, as different jurisdictions or regional planners might adopt different schemes, and then people would see how they work out, and over time, you could still travel around, but people could decide.
I defer to the technical people.
So a clarifying
Technical
question, were you
questions.
saying with the first part of the question, the algorithms that run the vehicles, the consistency there?
How much would that technology require certain, would it differ? You'd have to decide which direction you were going before the technology could evolve, and how much could the technology underlie multiple choices that could then, policy choices or design choices that then could evolve and people could sort of see which ones they like best. This is a flexible technology that can fit different
And
schemes.
the cars would know when they crossed boundaries, geographic boundaries, all in sort of this
So
I'm deferring to the technical expert, and you're deferring to the policy expert.
I'm going to jump right in.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where I'm So we're talking about not a technology, but actually a wide range of technologies, applications of those technologies, business cases for those applications, participants in those business cases. It's really diverse. And so the underlying technologies are going to evolve as engineering permits, and then it will be up to policymakers to help guide the ways in which those are applied. A few years ago, I wrote a paper called "How Governments Can Promote Automated Driving," and it was a little bit of a joke title. I was the only one who got the joke because I didn't actually want to promote automated driving. I wanted to promote other policy goals. People were really interested in automated driving, so that was the hook. And so I would bring that back to what you were saying, which is figure out what you want in the world, and then use every tool to get it. And that might mean, frankly, focusing more on conventional driving and conventional behaviors than automated driving. So if we've decided that single occupancy vehicles are bad, great. We don't need to wait for automated driving. We can raise fuel taxes. We can raise parking prices. We can implement community designs at lower speeds that will today help us get there, and it will actually improve the deployment of automated driving as well. If we decide that communities should be walkable, lower the speeds. That would be a tremendous benefit for automated driving and for communities. I do think that one of the ways that technologies, even without standardization, could help is they will liberate people from having to own one vehicle that they drive everywhere on every road. And once you've broken that, then you don't have to allow a big pickup truck in the middle of a small city with an engine that can allow it to go 120 miles an hour. That could be a real thing.
So I will jump in, I guess, a little bit. What do I know about the technology, right? I'm an economist, but my sense is if my software that I use to poll students in my class can have a geofence around it so that if they're not actually in the classroom, they can't get credit for answering questions when their friend texts them the question, then certainly it's got to be possible that when the car crosses some boundary and it's like, oh, I'm in Durham now, that it goes to the algorithm that says, in Durham, don't turn right on red. That sort of thing has to be possible. And I in general, love the idea that rather than just get to standardization, where we very well may pick the wrong horse, right? I don't think any of us know right now exactly what we want to see ultimately from this technology, that you allow there to be some experimentation as long as there's learning on the end of that, right? And that's the tricky part, right? So then how do you learn from different ways that states are approaching the functionality of these vehicles and then get some consistency over time based upon what we've learned from that.
Vince, I want to get to you, but one thing I just want to press on, because this is a strange panel in that
Thank you.
Yeah,
I'll just leave it with that. In that AI and regulating AI and using AI in regulation can't be separated in the way it could. I've said that before. So, but we're talking here around innovation and trying to help allow governments to find what's right and start to have the tools at their disposal to make decisions that are in line with their policy concerns, et cetera. but we're in a place where most of the data collection that drives these innovations is going to be being collected arguably by private actors, right? So it's the car companies that are deployed that are picking up the folks who know where they're driving, et cetera. So I don't want to delay, but this is one of the questions I want to make sure we got to because data is so important. How can we start off on the right foot and make sure that we are giving ourselves access to the data that's going to be needed to drive this innovation that helps us get to those policy goals? Are there best practices? Are there things we could be doing or should be thinking about now?
Yeah, I think best practices, I think, we're definitely developing those. I mean, this is an unknown area, so it's hard to figure that out. But I think one of the things that we need to work towards is to at least compartmentalize the types of data that we're going to need and not look at this as just this big cluster of data that's being used by the autonomous vehicles, because at a minimum, you're looking at the driving data itself that is imperative to doing accident reconstruction. So you want someone like, whether it's the NTSB or NHTSA, to be able to access that data, and we'll talk, I guess, another time about where the expertise comes from for doing that analysis. But the GPS, the control inputs, and all those things within the vehicle that would be crucial in figuring out how to make the car safer over time and who to give that to. That's extremely important information. But then on the flip side, there is how that same data could be used for tracking the person's position for advertising, knowing that you shop at Target versus Walmart and giving you targeted advertising for that, knowing what is the type of entertainment that you are using in your car at that particular point in time, and then selling that data off to somebody else and not wanting to do that. So I think it's important that we understand that it's not that there are different uses for it. I mean, much in the same way, with carrying your cell phone, you're tracking a lot of that similar type of data. I think it's going to be important to early on have an understanding of what is the crucial data that we need to make the car safer, and who's going to be responsible for that before we dismiss or start owning the data and not making it available.
Yeah. I'm ready, but
so I think a company like Google can say, yes, we want all data, that's great, because they can make something of it. I don't think that agencies like, say, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration are at a point where they would want to say, yes, give us everything, because as we've seen, they would drop it. So at least initially, I think a better approach for the kind of collaboration you're describing is for each side to come with two lists. From the public side, what do we have? In the sense, what are the resources that we could make available? Whether it's curbs or whether it's staging information for road construction, whether it's the personnel in the city. Here are the things that we have that might be of use to a private company. And a second list, here's what we want. And I don't think that needs to be specific data. I think it means we want to better understand how people move through a city. We want to know whether our emergency responders are dispatching to their correct hospital. Very specific functional questions. Because once you identify that, then the other side is going to be very creative, and if it's in their interest, find ways of actually achieving those with the data that they're collecting. And so that side should likewise have, here's what we want, and here are the sort of things that we might provide. And then as long as each side actually is empowered, and I keep coming back to that, then you can find these really interesting partnerships.
Because there is some assumption underlying that about how empowered the city is to come forward and bring forward those requests.
Right, they have to have two lists. They can't just have the one.
That's right.
And otherwise they're begging.
Oh, the federal government could have one list. Yeah, I mean, I think one of my concerns about data is that the private sector is going to have all the data, and they're frankly going to have more of the capacity to analyze those data, to help identify weaknesses in the system and potential solutions to the system. But what I would not want to see happen is that companies end up competing on safety. So that Nissan has its data processing center that's collecting all the data from the various Nissans that are traveling on the road, and it learns that, in this situation, it's best to do X, right? And then Toyota's got its own thing, and it's learned something, but Nissan didn't learn that. And then Ford's got its own, right? So and they're sort of competing with each other on safety. What I would rather see happen, and I don't have a great answer on how we get there, but airlines tend not to compete on safety. They compete on lots of things, right? But they don't go out and say, fly Delta, we don't crash. That are those American guys, they crash all the time. And it's partially because they've developed this, community of fate, right? This notion that if something bad happens on American, it's bad for Delta too, right? And so they're going to share information on safety that enables all of them to be better. That's what I would like to see us get to for, let them compete on all the characteristics of the vehicles, compete on everything you want to, except safety. But I don't think we're set up at the moment to head that direction.
So I'm queue-wise, I'm going to go Vince, back corner, Carrie, and then all the way in the back here. So those four.
So Bryant earlier mentioned some specific interventions like lowering the speed limit, and Lori talked about, well, maybe once you know you're in Durham, you don't turn right on red. I think we still do. But I was wondering if the panel had any thoughts about, given that it's a self-driving car that's run by algorithms, are there other kinds of requirements that we could impose on these self-driving cars? So fancifully, I imagine that to avoid your second scenario, I might get in the car and the car might tell me, I'm sorry, Vince, I'm afraid I can't let you drive to Roxborough. But that's maybe not really that realistic. But what kind of restrictions?
Not in this country.
What kind of restrictions on the way that the self-driving car makes decisions might be feasible, or might none of them be feasible? Might you impose that the car has to trade off risks to pedestrians versus occupants in a particular way? How would you even measure that? Is there any hope of doing something like that?
I think you could do any of that. I think it's a question of political will, right? I think you could make it so that the vehicle cannot speed, right? It absolutely cannot go over the speed limit. Now, we do that all the time, right? I set the cruise control, 5 miles over the speed limit.
You're on record.
That's the new speed limit. Exactly. It's not enough to get me pulled over, but it's enough to make me feel like I'm going faster. So we could make it so that the automated lorry is not allowed to do such a thing. And we could impose a whole bunch of restrictions on them. And the question is, in the current framework, where largely this is being left at the discretion of vehicle manufacturers and software developers, it's not at all obvious that that's where we would get. It's not clear to me that there's the political will for that. Certainly not to say, Vince, you can't live in Roxborough. You're not allowed to make a choice about housing costs versus transportation costs, trade-offs.
I would like to see those issues resolved, not for automated driving, but again for all vehicles and all participants. So if we've decided that following the law is good, great. Let's make sure everyone follows the law. And that could be with respect to the proper balance of pedestrian mobility and vehicular mobility, for example. I think the existing incentives, tort law, existing vehicle codes, simply a desire not to routinely run down people, will get these companies to the right place within technical feasibility on these broader questions. And so I would actually talk less about the algorithms, more about the companies deploying, what their obligations and responsibilities might be more generally. And this is tough. On one hand, I'd like to impose sort of a common carrier sense that these companies really have broad obligations to the public, broad obligations of non-discrimination, of open access, because they are becoming the shopping malls of the 21st century. On the other hand, I think that these companies can play an important role in promoting safety. So a more paternalistic regime in which you don't get to move in the vehicle unless you're wearing your seatbelt. In which you do need to uphold certain standards of the community to be in the vehicle, also makes sense. And so that's where I think we have these other trade-offs in the public sphere.
I'm going to give you a vague long-term future answer. First off, agreeing that we should lower speed limits where pedestrians are nearby to below 25 miles an hour. But one of the things that I find exciting with autonomous vehicles is that at some point, so I think one of the near-term mistakes that we make with autonomous vehicles is anthropomorphizing the computer that we're putting in the driver's seat. And that we're taking a computer and we're putting them in the exact same driving environment that we've been developing for over 100 years to meet our perceptual deficiencies with big signs and bright white lines and so forth. And so we're making the computer deal with the same problems that we already have. Where, as we've already, I think you even said in your presentation, we're good at different things. And what we're basically doing is creating something that is acting like a human, more or less, but never gets tired. And I think we can do better than that by leveraging, what the assets are of the computers, and not necessarily leveraging or needing something like computer vision, going beyond that by having the vehicle-to-infrastructure communication. So what I'm most excited about is as we'll eventually, I feel, get past that of having an infrastructure that's actually designed for a computer driver, and then being able to take full advantage of the future driverless vehicles. Whatever that may look like, I don't know, but I'm excited to see it.
So my name is Meredith. I'm a postdoc with Rethinking Regulation Institute in Laurie Johnson. And actually, your last comment really ties in well to my question, which is, if you go around the world and you do a little traveling, at least one of my favorite things is to notice how in different cities you can tell the dominant mode of transportation by the architecture of the city. If there's sort of small, windy little paths, you can tell that most people were walking, and the wider and bigger streets get, you sort of see a city that sort of developed in a time where people used horses and buggies, or cars. And especially over the 20th century, you've seen a lot of different changes in how cars are used in daily society and how they're sort of incorporated into our sort of physical infrastructure in cities. And so my question is sort of two parts. One, if you look back over the 20th century, is there a particular city or a particular model where they approached this question of transition from horses and buggies to cars really well that might have good lessons for transitioning from cars to automated vehicles? Or is there a way that infrastructure can help push us more to the system that Lori talked about, where there's automated vehicles running around where you just call for a pod that you want, that seemed like a great system, as opposed to sort of pushing along with the same system we have where the cars are exactly the same except that they do the things that we used to do with them.
Yeah, just to add to that, it looks to me like the transition is going to look very different in a place like Phoenix than it's going to look like Manchester, New Hampshire in the winter. So how do you think about that stuff?
Well, I mean, going to what you said, Frank, answering the question, that's one of the reasons why AVs are being tested in places like Mountain View, California, and Phoenix, because the roads are modern and well marked, and so you're leveraging their already good infrastructure. So I think the place.
But that's good for cars, right? That's
yeah.
not like, is it necessarily good for the best way of doing AV? Does that make sense? Or is that even a reasonable question?
Yeah, no, I think it's a reasonable question. It kind of ties into something that's a little bit, unsettling about it, is that as we, develop budgets and start funding road improvements right now, everything that's being agreed on, everything that's going into a budget is obsolete right now. And so at some point, there has to be either a decision made. We're going to continue with the way we're developing AVs right now to use, their computer vision algorithms, to use roads that are designed for humans, or at some point there has to be a decision made. We're going to start developing roads for AVs. And at some point, somebody has to make that choice. And then, of course, the money, like I don't even want to say billions because that doesn't seem high enough. It has to come from somewhere as well. So.
I would say grab small gains. If I look back on the 20th century, so we know, I think we can expect that automated driving and other technologies in the city, it's not just full-scale cars, shuttles, drones, all these things, are going to cause these brief blips in the way that people move and the way that cities can work. And so one example, it might be that automated driving can initially unlock some roadway capacity. That would be an instance for an astute city to step in and make sure that that doesn't just automatically get filled up by even more automated vehicles of a large size. You say, okay, our projections look like this road might have more capacity. Let's grab some of that and hold on to it. Anytime you have access to land or access to new data, grab that. And in that incrementalism, I think that we can avoid just falling into the same patterns with AVs.
Yeah, but again, assuming that somebody's thinking far enough out and has this vision of the future they want. I think on the transition, no, I can't. I lost my train of thought. Never mind. We'll take another question, and then maybe it'll occur to me.
So I think the cue is Carrie, back, Nicholson, Artie. Is that all right? Okay.
So it's a question directly for you, Lori.
Okay.
To think about to what extent the regulation of at least the vehicle, its system, from the standpoint of regulating the manufacturers, is an appropriate instance for management-based regulation. What can we learn from research on management-based regulation in other contexts that can translate over?
Oh, okay. So Carrie and I have done research on management-based regulation, and hence, his softball here to me. But so for those of you who aren't familiar with the lingo, management-based regulation is one where the government regulator imposes upon the regulated entities' businesses a requirement to do some risk management or environmental management, some sort of a management planning system to identify the risks, identify ways of reducing the risk, evaluate those opportunities, right? But what's not actually specifically required is that they do any of those things, right? And the idea is if the barrier is just that, in some sense, people aren't thinking hard enough about a particular problem, we will make them think hard, right? And if in the process of thinking hard they discover things that are beneficial to them, they will do it, right? And we, Carrie's got some theory papers that sort of suggest this is a good idea when you can't directly observe the outcome you care about. Although here I think we can observe safety to some level, but maybe not some of the other outcomes. So you can't regulate those things directly. I think that there's a lot of room here to, especially because industry's going to have way more information about what the potential risks are and data to help evaluate other alternatives than the government will initially, to put some of that onus on them to develop some risk management plans. And maybe as a first step, that makes sense. And then as it becomes clearer sort of what works and doesn't work, you could imagine having a more traditional sort of regulatory approach.
I'm Dan Dakin from the University of Illinois, and Lori was mentioning, aircraft people don't compete on safety, and a big reason for that is that there's an aviation incident database that's anonymous, and so that they all can learn from an incident that happens to one of them. And so I think that's something that you could see happening in this AV realm, but at the same time, there's perhaps trade secrets, proprietary information, all these new kind of tech companies want to make their own little walled gardens, so there's a lot of challenges there. And I think also with an AV, not only do you have kind of the crash, something got collided into, but there's also a whole network security piece. So then you have an incident database for network security as well. So I'm not sure exactly if I have a question, but just a comment on kind of this complexity comparing to just your comment about the safety in aviation.
Yeah. Well, there's also many fewer airlines, right? So, and manufacturers of airplanes. If we were really just talking about Nissan, Toyota, Ford, GM, whatever, I think we could wrap our heads around that. But that's not what the AV space is going to look like, because we've got software companies that are getting in the vehicle game, right? And so now we're talking about thousands of players that contribute in some way, shape, or form to the functioning of this vehicle. And I think it's trickier to manage that and to cultivate that sense that we're all in this together, right? I'm not really in it with you. If my thing doesn't work, I'll just go bankrupt. So that, I think it's just more challenging to cultivate that culture as well.
there's a lot of discussion about these kinds of collaborations or incident databases. And one very useful application for AI would be translating between very different systems. So just because company X's automated driving system has recorded an incident doesn't mean that will in any way be comprehensible or usable by company Y's system. But you could imagine with enough investment, a system that is able to, like a translator, take the information from one and make it relevant to the other.
Also, addressing one comment you had, we talked about safety, but I think you also mentioned cybersecurity. If you look at the federal guidance right now that's coming out of NHTSA and also that's written into the AV START Act, which is in the Senate right now, it actually says they are asking for the companies to share cybersecurity information. So again, this is guidance, it's optional, they ask for companies to do this, but in cybersecurity they mention specifically that they do want to share information there.
So I'm going to keep going with the queue if that's okay.
Yeah, so this is quite related. I still want to push on the kind of we don't compete or we shouldn't compete on safety, because of course the one analogy is like airlines, but the other obvious analogy to the car company is car companies, right, which explicitly do right now compete on safety and say things like, look, my car is way safer, you should totally buy. And it seems like that creates at least some incentive for car companies to have a race to the top in terms of safety, which doesn't seem terrible. And I'm wondering what's different about it. You mentioned that there are lots of players here, but of course it's also the case that in cars you have many manufacturers of parts for cars, all of which contribute to safety, but we still see like a centralization of responsibility in the relatively few big automakers or relatively few automakers, and that seems to work out okay. So I'm wondering what's different here. One answer is maybe we don't have enough data. Like any one company isn't going to have enough data to be able to do this well. And I'm not sure if I should be skeptical of that or not. So I really just want to know what's so different that the model that seems to work for car safety now won't work for car safety later.
Because now you're talking about the driver. Do you want the car that drives like a 16-year-old boy, or that drives, like a 45-year-old experienced driver, for example?
Go ahead.
That was all I had.
So I'm actually sympathetic to that vision. I think that saying we won't compete on safety is maybe a bit extreme, is because safety and capability are going to be so linked here that the ability of a company to safely deploy will determine where and under what conditions it's able to deploy. And so in that way, yes, I think there should be competition on safety and capability. And that developers, deployers, hosts should expect more as these systems get more capable. And I think that's distinct from you have a number of mature actors who have established their systems as reasonably safe. And there's a weird thing that happens, and they all try to figure out what went wrong so it won't happen again. That's different from what's happening now, where companies are aggressively trying to actually get capable systems. And for that reason would not want to hand all of their data to a startup that would not otherwise have it.
Yeah, so I guess that's a fair point. I think for me, my first reaction was the same as Michael's, that when we're talking about the vehicle, the safety of the vehicle itself, whether it has side airbags or anti-lock braking systems or automated braking, all of these things, it's in the vehicle itself. We could develop tests that demonstrate that it's safer and for crash test dummies or whatever. We're not actually talking about regulating the function of the vehicle on the road, right? How it handles particular situations, which does to me seem intuitively different. Now, I agree at some level the companies have an incentive to get that right, so maybe you would have, again, this sort of race to the top, but that assumes people can really understand what the algorithm is doing, right? And it's not just, I claim I have a safer algorithm, come buy my car. And that there's some ways to demonstrate the truthfulness of that claim. I guess I would also say one concern, if I was a manufacturer in this space, that I would have is that at this young stage where there are many of us, including, Jeff and myself, who are like, oh my God, please let this thing be happening before our children get to driving age. And we're like, gung-ho, like, yes, we want this. There are equally large, maybe larger numbers of people who think this is terrifying, right? I found out about the accident in Tempe where the self-driving Uber hit a pedestrian who was walking behind a bicycle with bags on it. On Facebook, because somebody on my Facebook feed said, this is terrible, we should outlaw these things. There's some group of people who view this in that way as well. So at some level, I feel like they should have a community of fate. If there's enough of those, it's not obvious to me that this gets off the ground, or at least it will be delayed significantly getting off the ground. They already pulled them from Phoenix. Several other companies pulled them off the streets in Pennsylvania and other places. But that doesn't seem to be the ethos that's developed at the moment. I mean, it seems to me, a bit as an outsider, it's the sort of Silicon Valley, like, death race, right? The first person who gets this right will win. And I don't know. I mean, I understand from a business perspective how that ethos is developed, but I'm not sure from society's perspective that's the best way to approach it.
So I want to go to Art, but one thing that we're highlighting here is this point, intersection again, where municipalities are making choices. They're saying this is part of our transportation system or it is not, right? Mm-hmm. By approving these systems at an early stage. And they need to have some capacity to say, we understand this technology, we understand what its potential is, we understand its risk. I always think of Chicago in the 1871 Elisha Otis elevator, right? And they're like, yeah, we can have these things lift people hundreds of feet above the ground, and people died, right? I mean, it was, but yet they were approving these things at a municipal level, right? At a transportation network in some way. And it's the complexity here. It's hard for me to imagine some cities being able to make these choices, but.
I wonder if maybe a concrete example might be useful. So several mentions of an incident database or an edge case sharing. And this has been discussed. The idea of companies would make available information about the weird things that happened in a way that could allow other companies to see if their systems would perform acceptably. And this has been talked about as possibly also being used in some sort of evaluative capacity, some sort of certification capacity. And what emerges is companies a lot of data saying, we like that, but we want to make sure that we're not just applying all this information that others learn from. And regulators are saying, well, we like that, but we want to make sure that companies aren't just designing for the test. Because if you have this database of things you have to do, you're going to do those. You can do those great, and you might not do the others. And so one suggestion that's emerged made is that you have a database like this, and companies get to test their systems against it, but then they have to make the results public. So you get your visit into this database, but everybody finds out how you did.
So I'm just going to move this up a slight level of abstraction. So I think that in part what, Laura, you were suggesting is, so we have different models of how we can address collective action problems. So one is some sort of self-regulatory mechanism, but oftentimes those fail. And that's why we have regulation that is slightly more command and control. And in the car space, what we have is a baseline level of regulation, and then above that, people compete. So, there is some baseline level that every car manufacturer has to meet, and then above that, we think it's okay to have people die. And that would presumably be the same with AV, that, you couldn't be a 15-year-old, but maybe you could be a 25-year-old. So I'm not sure, why is this space so different? Why is it's just a question of like, okay, we'll have a baseline level of regulation, and then above that, maybe either self-regulatory norms, or we'll just have people compete.
So maybe it's not. I mean, maybe I'm going to have to take back my whole "don't compete on safety" thing. But one way in which it could be is that, again, the baseline level of safety for the vehicle, right, is something that can be established and tested. The baseline level of safety for the algorithm that drives the vehicle, we'd have to define what that looked like, right? And if we did that, we could presumably test it and say that's okay. But then the vehicle's going to be out there encountering new situations and learning new things all the time. And you're going to want to update, right? And you can't update the software, you can't be testing every update, right? Or every new thing that the vehicle learns, right? And every slight change in the algorithm that it makes as it's learning from this thing. And so it's not obvious to me how you maintain that then over time. If you want to have, I think you would, that the vehicle is capable of, the machine is capable of learning from its surroundings and developing better ways of operating.
So the issue is one of adapting the regulation to the adaptation of technology that occurs.
The speed of the way in which that
doesn't
will change.
happen with the physical car. Okay. Well then, that's very interesting. And I think that that's the key difference. It's not that people won't compete on safety or people won't, do other things that they do in other spaces, because they do. But I don't see any reason to be particularly optimistic about self-regulation in this space. At least I'm not optimistic about self-regulation in most spaces. So, so the issue is, how do we deal with a regulation of a rapidly changing system? And I think that's the key, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's how we got interested in this with the adaptive regulation. It's precisely that.
Yeah.
But I mean, I do think, there's been some discussion. Maybe, Michael, you mentioned that, like, Nissan was going to have these control centers where, all of the data from all of the Nissans come in, and so it's not just any individual, Nissan Sentra driving down the road that's learning from its environment, but it's learning from all the Nissans, that are deployed. That sounds awesome, but why are we limiting that to Nissan? And so I think that's the difference there.
Right.
Can I add one thing? I think two things that seem different to me in this area are that, and maybe we'll get to you, Michael, on this, that there's this strange area. I can't think of other areas where we have robots, right? Moving automated things working alongside us in the same way. So we're not automatically flipping a switch and then having all autonomous vehicles. We're bringing them into our normal environment. And so there's a lot of just public distrust, right, with operating that way, and that's kind of a human factors type of concern, I think. The other is that at some point it becomes a systemic risk. So the licensed driver, when I remember getting my license at 16, I thought, who the hell are these people who gave me a license? I mean, this is just, I was self-reflective enough. Other people must have thought it was even more idiotic, but I even thought it was idiotic. But I knew if I crashed into something, it was likely to be the tree at the end of my driveway, or heaven forbid, one other person on the road or something. But at some point here, we're talking about systemic reshapings of our transportation networks, where maybe cars are driving a foot apart from the bumper in front of them, some of the other things that we're changing. I think that level of what we're regulating, to me, it doesn't seem like a threshold licensing makes as much sense anymore. We actually have to have a whole categorically different level of certainty around the structure and how it can be regulated on an ongoing basis. To me, that feels very different, but I don't know if that...
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's good. Yeah.
So a couple of things. One, there's two questions out there that I want to make sure we get to, but we talked about this before. I wanted to make sure that, Michael, maybe you could comment on that human factors issue, because it's a really important one in this sector. So
yeah. So this issue came up in the first session also, that there is an assumption, as that you add more automation to the system, that you remove the human element, or perceive to remove the human element, you automatically make it safer. That you are designing human error out of the system. But what we found over and over again over time is that what you're doing at that point is that you're just moving the task from being a more physical one to being a cognitive task. And so now, instead of the human operating a manual system, you are now having a person who has a computer teammate. And one of the things and this is basically what makes this whole aspect, this is a more broad conversation, but this is what makes the aspect of transparency and explainable AI so important, because you can't necessarily just mandate training on the individual or just give them the system and assume that it's going to work. In a number of different domains, aerospace and defense in particular, there's a wide body of research that investigates this exact topic of transparency. And just what I wanted to share, and this is more in response to a question I think that was given to Carrie this morning, is how do you design with that in mind? And so, while the conversation was going on, I went back and looked at a paper on this topic, that essentially what happens if you have a system, that it's very important to build trust with the operator, because what happens is you could have one of two different situations if your trust isn't calibrated correctly. You can either have the person under trusting the situation, which is bad. And look at, if any of you have a car that has some kind of a lane keeping advisory, there's a good chance that you've turned that off, because as you start to, if you're not staying right in the middle of your lane, it starts beeping at you and it's annoying. It's not giving you any information, so you just shut it off. So this is a situation where you don't find the system reliable and you just stop using it. Now you don't get the benefits of it anymore. Then on the flip side of it, you have this thing called overtrust. And with overtrust is you don't have a full understanding of what the system's capabilities are, but you rely on it completely. And then when it fails, you get yourself into trouble. And a tragic example of this is in Tempe, Arizona, where the Uber struck the woman who was crossing the roadway because the person was no longer, the test driver was no longer attending to the roadway, was pretty much most likely used to driving this car around and wasn't paying attention and wasn't able to steer out of the way or to hit the brakes. So what you want to try to do is give a full understanding to the user of what the system can actually do. So, and that's basically where the transparency, where the explainable AI comes in, is that that's how you achieve that proper level of trust, where they're using it for the right things. And basically, I'll just go, in the interest of time, I'll try to keep this to a brief list. What we're looking for is we're designing for, emphasize it's appropriate trust, it's not greater trust. You don't want somebody to necessarily fully rely on it, because as we've all seen, if any of us use computers, they fail sometimes. And you have to know what to do in the event that they do fail. You want to show the person that, give them an understanding of what the past performance is, so they know what the reliability is. You want to be able to show them the process and the algorithms that they're using. This gets back into transparency. Let them understand how it's working, what it's doing, what's the information that goes into it. Make sure they fully understand the purpose and the scope of the automation. What is it meant to do? Artificial intelligence, despite the name, that it has this broad scope that nears human, we've already discussed. It's actually fairly narrow in scope and only addresses certain tasks. Make sure that information is clear to the people who are using these systems, so they know what the capabilities are, so they don't use them incorrectly. And then make sure that the operators, to the best extent that you can, that they're trained on the reliability. Let them know in what situations they can fail, so when it does happen, that they're able to address the situation. And then the last thing is, be careful about anthropomorphizing the automation. Don't make the person assume that they're dealing with a human teammate, because as we discussed this morning, people and humans, people and computers react differently, and they're good at different things, and they shouldn't necessarily be compared. So here.
Yeah. So and I'm Libby Evans with the Duke Digital Initiative. We've talked a lot about, maybe this is not an appropriate question, but we've talked a lot about the sort of directly related to the technology. Or you made a comment that just made my brain sort of spin out of control about how.
That's good or bad, but we'll find out.
That's a good thing. How people may end up living their way now, right? So one of the things I wonder, all new technologies have unexpected consequences. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes just different. Are there consequences that you can think of that AVs might have on society as a whole, like maybe right now people who work in lower paid jobs live further away from centers of employment because it's cheaper? Might that reverse, or are there other kinds of consequences like that that may arise out of the increasing use of AVs?
Almost certainly. What they are, and nobody quite knows, but I think we can anticipate some potential, consequences. And if we don't like those, think about ways in which we could create incentives or craft policies that help potentially mitigate those, right? So, we work for one of the largest employers in the greater Durham area. If everybody has to get to work at 8:30 or 9 o'clock, and everybody wants to leave at 5 or 5:30, the roaming pod world that I described, where just it comes and picks up, not going to work very well, because there's going to need a whole bunch during certain times of the day, and then they got to be parked somewhere. So I'm not turning all these parking lots into green space and all the other wonderful things. So how do we work with major employers to think about what their workforce of the future will look like in a way that might better accommodate a more environmentally friendly, greener, more livable city, as opposed to, everybody's living in Roxborough and using the commute in to, do their mind-numbing email and phone calls. So some of those challenges we might be able to anticipate. Some of them we won't. I mean, at one point somebody said, when you thought about the internet back in the early 90s, you were like, all right, this is a cool thing. Like, I can print a book and put it on my shelf, as opposed to going somewhere and buy. We don't use the internet that way. Like, we couldn't have anticipated the ways in which it was going to transform our life, both for the good and the bad, right? So some I think we can anticipate a little and work to craft a future that's closer to what we might want, and others we'll be surprised.
There's one more question, I think, over here.
Yeah, so maybe this is just me, but for some reason, the idea of myself or someone I care about getting hit and injured or killed by one of these autonomous vehicles makes me angrier as compared with the idea of someone getting hit by a reckless driver. And I don't know why that is really, but maybe it has something to do with what Nicholson was talking about earlier as I feel like maybe I could kind of recognize a reckless driver on the road and there are certain signs you could look for and maybe try to stay away from them, whereas you wouldn't know, when an autonomous vehicle was going to make a mistake. So that was more of just a comment.
But you're not alone. I mean, some of the public backlash after the Tempe accident, you heard that a lot. People were, we're not used to people being killed by computers in that way. And there was a sense that, well, we understand what the legal process would be for seeking justice, right? If my loved one is killed by a reckless driver, like, we understand what that process would be. And it was less like, what would the process be when an algorithm kills my loved ones? So I don't know that we couldn't overcome that eventually, and you might not eventually feel differently, but at least initially, I think that there's a lot of people who share your views.
I've spoken a lot with families of victims, and they don't feel that way because their loved ones are dead, and so they're saying, how could that have been prevented?
Here.
I was struck by Professor Clamann's forgive me if I pronounce it wrong, very brilliant list of what you would need to do to properly train drivers under this system. But I'm also struck by the thought that it won't ever happen. I mean, the reason that you got driver's license at 16, I grew up in Colorado, is because they needed the kids to work on the farm, so that's why they gave them so early. But how are you ever going to get that level of training that I think you're right, that you would need? And if you can't get that level of training, why are we moving so fast in that direction where you need that level of training?
Yeah, the training it's not, so this is one aspect of good human factors design. The best case scenario is to design a system that's intuitive to the individual that doesn't require training. The less training, the better. And that is a big challenge. And that's done through iterative design, several different, extensive empirical testing to find out what works with the broadest audience. So that's, when you're designing these sorts of interfaces, that's where you start. But yes, I mean, the training is a huge issue. I mean, it's an issue right now, to the point where people are buying these, fantastic cars with all these great, features, and the people on the sales floor aren't training the customers how to use them. So they end up, with analog brakes and lane keeping and automatic emergency braking, and no one has actually introduced these things to them. They don't know how to set them up. And so one of the first things we need to do is figure out how that's going to work. To start working with the automobile manufacturers and make it normal, that this training starts to happen. But yes, I agree that the way that we license our drivers in this country is pretty atrocious.
So I kind of feel like we've entirely solved this issue, but okay, keep going. Go.
On that last point, I think even if you can master the way your own car works, and I find this even now, I've got a car that has a backup camera and a side for camera for turning. And then when I rent a car that doesn't have that, or it's got a whole different setup, it's something that is a different driving experience. And I don't know if that's a potential source of risk that people are really even thinking about, but unless there's a real standardization to these systems, whenever you rent a car, you are going to be, it's at least operating at least a suboptimal level.
I mean, I could do a whole afternoon on all the human factors problems with cars right now. And then what you're talking about is definitely one of them. I have that problem. Just my wife and I both drive Japanese cars, and what you just described, as soon as I'm backing her car, which doesn't have a backup camera, and mine does, even though they were made in the same year, that's immediately is an issue. The fact that, when I'm driving my car, which I've driven a lot more, if it suddenly starts to rain, I could just reach down without looking and turn on my windshield wipers. I know where the lights are. I basically have a good feel for all that works. As soon as I rent a car or drive a different one, all of that training goes away. And I'll tell you, one of the things that I don't have this in my car. I specifically bought a car of the model year that I have because it does not have a touch screen, which I find, appalling that more and more cars have an interface that requires you to look down at it while you're driving. I'm just saying, yes, that's a huge problem.
John, you want to finish this?
I do think it's important to close to let Jeff know that when right turn on red was implemented, it was very safe because you could only take the right on red if Carole King was playing on your 8-track.
Which was 24/7.
Tapestry was looting.
Well, thank you very much for this.
I don't quite get that.
No one says, well, this